Hello, everyone, and welcome back to Panic Peak. Let me know where you're listening from in the world by leaving a comment, and don't forget to like and subscribe for more horror stories. Now, let's dive in. Story 1. Whispers in the Snow. Everwind was a quiet town, the kind of place where winter felt magical. Nestled at the edge of an endless forest, it was a postcard-perfect village come December, its streets glowing under a blanket of pristine snow and twinkling holiday lights. But the forest held its secrets, and the people of Everwind knew better than to wander too far into the trees after dark. The old-timers spoke of strange things in the woods, shadows that moved where they shouldn't, whispers on the wind, and footprints that led nowhere. Most dismissed it as folklore, stories meant to keep children close to home. Lucy Gallagher, however, had always loved the winter. She'd moved to Everwind only a year ago, eager for the peace and quiet the town promised. Tonight, though, as she stood at her kitchen window and watched the snowstorm begin to rage, something about it made her shiver. It wasn't just the cold creeping through the cracks in her old house. It was the feeling that the storm was alive, that it was watching her. The snowflakes came faster now, swirling like ghostly dancers under the streetlight. That's when Lucy saw it. A figure, barely more than a shadow, standing just at the edge of her property line. It was still, unnaturally still, but its outline was clear against the snow, tall, looming, wrong. Lucy blinked, and it was gone. She rubbed her eyes and forced a laugh. Just the storm playing tricks. But she couldn't shake the feeling that something had looked back at her, something that had seen her. By midnight, the storm had grown monstrous. The power had failed hours earlier, leaving Lucy's house silent and still, except for the creaking of the walls and the rattling of the windows. Her phone offered little comfort. There was no signal, no connection to the outside world. Wrapped in a blanket, Lucy sat by the fireplace watching the flames dance. She hated the way the shadows moved across the room, like they were alive, stretching too long, flickering too fast. Thud. The sound came from upstairs. Lucy sat bolt upright, her breath catching in her throat. Her house was old, yes, but that sound, it had weight. The wind, she whispered to herself. She didn't believe it. Forcing herself to stand, she grabbed the fireplace poker, a pitiful weapon, but it felt better to hold something heavy. She climbed the stairs, one creaking step at a time, each one swallowing her in dread. The hallway was pitch dark, save for the faint glow of moonlight filtering through the frost-bitten windows. Her breath clouded in the icy air. Thud. It came again, from the guest room. Lucy's hands trembled as she pushed the door open. Empty. The sound was gone, the room still and freezing. But something was wrong. The window was open, snow drifting onto the floor. She was certain she'd locked it. Lucy rushed to close it, her hand freezing to the touch of the icy latch. As she leaned forward to pull it shut, her eyes fell to the snow outside. Footprints. They led from the woods to her house and vanished at the window's edge. Her breath hitched. Someone's been here. Lucy slammed the window shut and stumbled back, gripping the poker tighter. The footprints were already fading under the relentless fall of snow, as though the storm itself were hiding them. From the corner of her eye, she caught movement, a shadow shifting under the bed. She turned slowly. "Hello," she croaked. Silence. With trembling fingers, she crouched low, the poker raised. She yanked the blanket up and peered into the darkness beneath the bed. Nothing. A burst of relief flooded her, only to freeze in her chest. The whisper returned. "Lucy." It came from behind her. She whirled around, heart pounding, but the room was empty. The voice had sounded like the wind, but she knew it wasn't. Suddenly, all the lights in the house flickered on, and then they died again. By the time dawn threatened to break, Lucy hadn't slept. She sat curled on the couch, eyes wide, the fire long dead. The storm had finally quieted, leaving a heavy silence in its wake. Snow pressed up against the windows, drowning the house in a cocoon of white. But it wasn't over. There were voices now, low, murmuring, constant. They rose and fell like a tide just beyond the walls. Sometimes they laughed, brittle and hollow, like the sound of breaking ice. Lucy didn't dare look outside. She sat, unmoving, clutching her poker as though it would keep her safe. Then came the knock. 3 slow, deliberate raps at the front door. Lucy's breath froze in her lungs. The knocks came again, louder this time. Whoever was on the other side didn't care about the cold. They didn't care about the snow piled against the door. "Don't open it," something inside her screamed. "Don't look." But the knocks turned to pounding, furious, relentless. The door rattled against its hinges, the sound booming through the house. Lucy stumbled to her feet, stumbling backward. She turned to run, but the pounding stopped. Silence. Then the handle turned. Click. The door swung open. The snowstorm had returned, swirling in the threshold like a living thing. A figure stood just beyond the snow, impossibly tall, its form obscured by the whirling white. And then it stepped inside. Lucy screamed. The figure was draped in shadows, its limbs too long, its head bent at an unnatural angle. It didn't speak, but its presence seemed to fill the room, pushing the air from Lucy's lungs. She turned to run, but the thing was suddenly in front of her, blocking her path. It reached out a hand. Its fingers were black as coal and ended in jagged claws. When they brushed her skin, the cold was unbearable, a deep, ancient chill that froze her to the marrow. "Please," she whispered, tears freezing on her cheeks. The figure tilted its head as though considering her plea. Then it smiled, a thin, splintering grin of razor teeth and ice. And the whisper came again, curling through the dark. "Come with us." The wind howled. The door slammed shut, and Lucy was never seen again. When the storm finally cleared, the people of Everwind emerged to a landscape buried under feet of snow. Search parties were sent out for the missing woman. Her house stood untouched, the doors locked from the inside, a fire still smoldering in the grate. But they found no sign of Lucy Gallagher, only her footprints leading from her front door into the woods, and vanishing in the snow. At the edge of the forest, just as the searchers turned back, a whisper curled on the wind. "Lucy." Some say it was just the wind, but the footprints were back the next morning, leading to another house. End of the story. Story 2. The Invitation to Pine Hollow. The invitation had arrived weeks earlier, scrawled in Grandma Garrett's shaky handwriting, a tradition she refused to let go of even in the age of text messages. It called for the entire Garrett family to come together for their annual Christmas gathering, this time in the old family cabin deep in Pine Hollow. The cabin had been built generations ago by one of their ancestors, a logger who had carved out his living in the wilds. Now the place was more of a relic, a dusty, creaking structure isolated in a stretch of forest untouched by time. It sat at the edge of a forgotten clearing, miles away from civilization. The road to the cabin was little more than a winding path through dense, brooding woods. Over the years, the family had grown accustomed to its charms, the way the wind whispered through the trees, the thick layers of snow that blanketed the roof, and the undeniable feeling of being cut off from the rest of the world. Despite its remoteness, the family agreed to come. It had been too long since everyone had gathered under one roof. It would be nice, Grandma insisted, to spend Christmas surrounded by nature. No distractions, no chaos, just each other. And so they came, 20 members of the Garrett clan, packed into cars and SUVs, driving slowly up the frozen path as snowflakes the size of feathers floated through the air. Grandma Garrett led the way, with Grandpa Ed beside her, still grumbling about his aching back. Uncle Don, big and boisterous, arrived with a case of beer and a lit cigarette dangling from his lips. Aunt Nancy brought her usual fussing and casserole dishes. Mark and Lucy came with their kids in tow, their laughter echoing as they piled out of the car. The younger cousins chased each other around the clearing, kicking up clouds of snow. For the first few hours, the cabin felt alive with warmth and joy. The fireplace crackled as logs burned low. Coats were hung on hooks, and boots left puddles on the wooden floors. The children raced through the narrow halls, their laughter spilling into every room. The adults unpacked gifts and food, joking and catching up. Christmas music crackled faintly from a small radio, adding a cheerful, if slightly tinny, soundtrack to their preparations. The Garretts had survived many Christmas gatherings here over the decades. The cabin had always been a place for nostalgia, for family bonds, for laughter over board games, and for mugs of hot cocoa shared by the fire. But this time something felt different. The air was colder, the shadows longer. The woods outside were eerily quiet, as though holding their breath. Then the storm came. The cabin sat deep in the woods, nestled at the edge of Pine Hollow. The area was once a bustling logging camp over a century ago, but it had long been abandoned to the elements. Now it was little more than a forgotten stretch of wilderness, where tall skeletal trees swayed in the unrelenting wind, and snow blanketed the earth like a cold, suffocating shroud. Miles from the nearest town, the woods had an eerie silence about them, a silence that felt alive, as though the forest itself watched and listened. The cabin, built by a distant relative generations ago, loomed at the end of a narrow, winding path that could barely be called a road. Its wooden walls were blackened and gnarled from decades of winters. Icicles hung from the roof like jagged teeth, and the windows were fogged, offering only distorted glimpses inside. The Garrett family had come to this place many times before, always for Christmas, drawn by the nostalgia of a simpler time. This year, however, something felt different. The snow began to fall as the Garretts arrived in their cars, tires skidding over frozen earth. The family spilled out, 20 relatives in all, their boots crunching through the first few inches of powder. The woods were strangely still, as though holding its breath. "It's good to be back," Grandma Garrett declared, stepping onto the creaking porch with a shiver. The cabin, for all its isolation, was charming at first glance. The smell of pine lingered inside, mingling with the faint scent of dust. A massive stone fireplace dominated the main room, its hearth ready for a roaring fire. The family settled in quickly, children chasing each other through the narrow halls, adults unpacking boxes of food and gifts, and the elders collapsing into armchairs by the fire with steaming mugs of cocoa. For a moment, everything was perfect, the epitome of a traditional Christmas gathering. Then the storm arrived. By nightfall, the wind howled like a living thing, battering the cabin with fists of ice and snow. Trees groaned under the weight of it, their limbs snapping in the distance. The family huddled together in the main room, the fire crackling loudly as if to drown out the sounds outside. "This is nothing," Uncle Don said with a grin, puffing on a cigarette near the back door. "I've seen worse in the 80s. A little snow never hurt anyone." But when he cracked the door to step outside for a smoke, the wind slammed into him so violently that he stumbled backward, knocking over a stack of firewood. Snow whirled inside the room before the door could be slammed shut again. "That's no storm," Uncle Don muttered under his breath, shaking snow from his jacket. His face had gone pale. By morning, the Garrett family was trapped. At first, it seemed manageable. The family had planned for a weekend, so the pantry was well stocked with bread, canned goods, and snacks for the kids. They stoked the fire, brewed coffee, and settled in for what they assumed would be a couple of days of being snowed in. But as the hours dragged into days, the snowstorm only grew worse. The windows were buried under thick drifts of snow, plunging the rooms into a perpetual gray darkness. The power flickered and failed on the second day, leaving them with only flashlights, candles, and the glow of the fire. The temperature plummeted, forcing everyone to stay close to the hearth. By the fourth day, the food was nearly gone. "We need to ration," Aunt Nancy said, her voice trembling. "If we're careful, we can stretch what's left until the storm clears." But even as she spoke, the children began to cry, soft, pitiful wails of hunger that seemed to fray the edges of everyone's sanity. Meals became meager, little more than half-spoons of canned beans or crackers split among four. The firewood, too, began to dwindle, and Uncle Don muttered about chopping some from the surrounding forest. "Don't be stupid," Grandpa Ed snapped. "You'll never make it back in this storm. We wait. Someone will come looking for us." "If we last that long," Don shot back, but he said no more. It was then that the suspicion started. On the seventh night, Uncle Don disappeared. The family searched the cabin, calling his name, but found nothing but his boots left near the back door. Fresh snow tracked inward, bare feet leading into the storm. Grandpa Ed insisted no one follow the tracks. "He knew what he was doing," he said gravely. "He's gone now." The next morning, Aunt Nancy was gone too. Her cries had woken Lucy in the night, faint and desperate, but no one could find her. In the dark, Lucy swore she heard something scratching at the walls, a low groan in the wind. By the 10th day, the survivors huddled near the dying fire, hollow-eyed and shaking. "I don't think we're alone here," whispered Lucy. In the silence, they heard it too, something moving just outside, brushing against the cabin walls. The door creaked open. When rescuers arrived days later, they found the cabin buried under snow. Inside, the walls were stained red. A single cousin sat near the fireplace, rocking back and forth, whispering, "The storm let them in." End of the story.